Welcome to European Journeys. This is the third stage of a series that takes us to Latvia and Estonia, where we explore the Reformation that happened there in the 16th century. Now, Latvia and Estonia were part of one and the same land known as Livonia, so the Reformation there is specifically known as the Livonian Reformation. Now, for our first two stages of this series, we were exploring locations in Latvia. And this is where we are remaining again for this stage. We are in fact returning to the capital of Latvia, which is obviously Riga. For our previous stage, we were visiting St. Peter's Church, the main church of the city. And for our stage today, we are going to see not a church, but the town hall of Riga. And it is located really at a stone's throw from the church, so really a short walking distance. Now, the town hall, as you can see on the picture, is a white edifice built in the architectural classical style of the 19th century. It was built in the 19th century by the Latvian architect, or the Latvian architect who conceived that was named Johann Daniel Fersko. Now, before the 19th century, other town halls had been built on that same specific location. And that was also the case at the time of the Reformation. The town hall was located right there. And the reason we want to see the town hall is because there the city council took important decisions, bold decisions that really would have an enormous impact, not only in Riga, but all across Livonia. So it is really important that we stop here, that we talk a little bit about what happened here. Now, at this stage, we need to do a little summary of what I talked about in our previous stage, the second stage, and if you haven't watched it, I recommend you go to our archive to watch it. But in that stage, we were talking about who was the main reformer of Livonia. His name was Andreas Knöpken. He had been already in Riga before the Reformation, and then he went to study theology in Treptow, which is today in Poland. It was at the time in Germany. And that's where he met the Lutheran doctrines. And he adopted the Reformation. He converted really to the message of the gospel. And when he returned to Riga, he was decided that he would preach only from the gospel, which was really a bold decision at the time because the Roman Catholic Church was preaching more from the tradition, from the teaching, springing from tradition rather than from the Bible directly. So Andreas Knöpken took a very bold decision. Now, his preaching began to gather crowds of people around him, and the Reformed movement really grew in Riga. But Andreas Knöpken was not the first one to encounter the Lutheran doctrines in Riga. Before his return in Riga, in 1521 that was, before that, some people already had heard about the Lutheran doctrines and even accepted them. And one of them was, in fact, the city secretary. His name was Johann Lochmüller. Lochmüller had accepted the doctrines of the Reformation, and he had even himself written directly to the leader, the main leader of the Reformation. Obviously, I'm talking about Martin Luther. So the doctrines were already there, but it was really Andreas Knöpken who brought that to the crowds there and began to gather a significant amount of people around him. Well, that obviously made the Roman Catholic hierarchy angry, and so a public disputation was organized. And as we talked about it already in our last stage, we saw that the public disputation of 1522 had led to the triumph, really, of the defense of the Lutheran doctrines. And several people in the city council really understood that this was the right way to go. The Lutheran doctrines were more consistent, really, with the gospel, with the Bible. And not only Johann Lochmüller, the city secretary, had adopted the Lutheran doctrines, but even the mayor of the city, a man who was named Konrad Durkop. So as you can see, the city council really was massively in favor of the Reformation doctrines. But for the Roman Catholic hierarchy, they had realized that the disputation went wrong. They could not defend their position from rational arguments, from defense of their belief system. And so they decided to take the next step. And what was the next step at the time? You remember, the Roman Catholic hierarchy was really ruling over the country, had an enormous influence over the rule of the country. Well, they decided to gather a deed in Volmar, that is Valmiera today, not so far from Riga, an hour or so northeast from Riga. And they gathered a deed there that was a general estates, a sort of parliament, if you want. And during that deed, they announced that they declared the Lutheran teachings as heretical. And that was very important. That was very significant, because at the time, if you were declared heretical, that meant that you were sent to the margins of society. You did not exist anymore. You could even be threatened to death. So it was a serious, there were serious consequences if you were declared heretical. So anyone who would adopt the teachings of Martin Luther would be declared heretical. Well, the atmosphere in Livonia had changed. For the previous 300 years, the Roman Catholic hierarchy had been able to rule and to enforce their own teachings over the land. But this time, it did not work. And nobles, people, the knights of the main cities of Livonia, such as Reval, which is today Tallinn, or Dorpat, which is today Tartu, and Riga, did not accept the decision and decided to ignore that. And so did the city council. The city council simply did not endorse the decision of the deed. And that was new. That was something totally new that had never happened really before in Livonia. Now, the city council did not decide to rebel and just go their own way. At first, they really wanted to find a common ground with the Archbishop of the city, who was named Jasper Linde, and you see his face depicted on this coin next to Walter von Plettenberg, who was in fact the main ruler of the land. On the secular side, it was the master of the Livonian order. So the man on the left is Jasper Linde, the Archbishop. And so they wanted to find a common ground, and so they asked Jasper Linde to appoint a preacher of the gospel in the church, that is in St. Peter's Church. But Jasper Linde was hardened. He would not give way, he would not give ground to the Lutheran doctrines by any means. And so he refused. And this pushed the city council to take the bold decision to appoint themselves an evangelical preacher at St. Peter's Church. And obviously they chose Andreas Knöpken. But not only, they also appointed an evangelical preacher in the second main church of the city, and we're going to talk about that in our next stage. But this was really a bold decision. The city council deciding to ignore the position of the Roman Catholic authorities, to ignore the position of the Archbishop of Riga, and appointed themselves an evangelical preacher in St. Peter's Church. So that was really groundbreaking, a decision that would embolden the Reformation movement in Livonia. Now, there is another point that we would like to talk about the city council, that Martin Luther had written a letter to encourage the reformers of Livonia, the reform movement of Livonia. He had written a good letter, and it was the city council itself that decided to answer Martin Luther. And when we read the answer, we really see the sense of calling that the city council had, the feeling, the sense of calling before God, that the city council existed, submitted to God and submitted to God's will, to do God's will in Livonia. And this is what they wrote back to Martin Luther as they saw themselves. This is what they wrote, that they saw their role to be for the spread of the true faith and the right hope for the betterment, help, and consolation of our neighbors, brothers and sisters, also with works, and thus in united brotherly love, in one faith and hope. So the City Council saw itself as mandated by God for the betterment, help, and consolation of their neighbors, that is, of the people of not just Riga, but at least of Riga, but even beyond. They really saw their call to spread the gospel and the Reformation beyond Riga. Now, as a conclusion, nowadays, this kind of decision from a city council or from a parliament or whatever secular authority would be seen as not religiously neutral at all. But in fact, the city council knew a bit better than the way we understand things today. They realized that the gospel was the only truth, and it would only be the gospel that would liberate the people. The truth shall set you free, says the gospel. They really knew that only the preaching of the gospel to the people of Livonia, to the people of Riga first of all, of course, because they were the city council of Riga, but to the people of Livonia as a whole, the preaching of the gospel would set the people free and would set Livonia free from the yoke of slavery, of false doctrines, which was controlling the entire land in Livonia up until then. I'm Cedric Placentino. See you next week for another stage of European Journeys.